Let's finish out this lecture by showing you a video that covers the Burgess Shale, which is a really cool shale that actually has some preserved soft parts in it. So we can learn a lot about early life, or at least 500 million year old life, by looking at this Burgess Shale.
Hello, my name is Michael Wise-Session, and welcome to Lecture 6 of our course on the geologic wonders of the world. Now, in the last lecture, we were in Africa and we looked at the Erta Ale lava lake in Ethiopia. In this lecture, we're going to look at something totally different, and we're going to go to Yoho National Park in the Canadian Rockies, up along the border between Alberta and British Columbia, in order to visit a layer of rock called the Burgess Shale. Now, the Canadian Rockies are about as pretty as you can get in terms of mountain scenery. Tall, sharp, snow-covered peaks rising up out of pine-forested valleys. And two of the jewels of the Canadian Rockies are the Canadian National Parks at Banff and Jasper. Frankly, if you ever have an extra week or two, one of the most spectacular train rides in the world goes from Vancouver on the coast way up into Banff and Jasper, winding its way through the Canadian Rockies. Now, these mountains are a continuation of the Continental Divide up from the American Rockies. And the Continental Divide is the boundary between major watersheds, such that any rain that falls east of the Continental Divide, up in Canada there, ends up either in Hudson Bay or the Arctic Sea, and therefore in the Atlantic Ocean. Any rain that falls on the west side of the Canadian Rockies winds its way down into the Pacific Ocean. The Canadian Rockies are different from their American counterparts in a couple different ways. The American Rockies are taller, but the Canadian Rockies are actually much steeper. They rise higher above the surrounding valleys. The Canadian Rockies tend to be more jagged from the greater degree of glaciation they've undergone, and because they're also at a higher latitude, their tree line is lower. So there's a lot more rock exposed. It's really a geologist's delight there. The American Rockies were pushed up from below, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next lecture on the Grand Canyon. The Canadian Rockies formed from horizontal compression from the west coast during an episode of subduction, just like we talked about it in the lecture on Japan. But most importantly for this lecture, the American Rockies are mostly igneous and metamorphic rock, which form deep beneath the surface. The Canadian Rockies are mostly ancient sedimentary rock, rocks like limestone and shale. These rocks formed at and beneath the floors of ancient shallow seas, and therefore they contain a lot of fossils. Now, there's one particular location, not far from Banff and Jasper, right along the border between Alberta and British Columbia, where the ancient rock, a particular layer of shale, is right at about 505 million years old. Now, I have to say that isn't very unusual. Shale is a very common rock. It's compressed mud, usually from ancient shorelines. So this means that the middle of Canada, however, was at least once in its history covered by the ocean. Now, that's fascinating, but it's also not unusual. Most parts of continents have actually been flooded by the sea at several points in their past. And in an age of 505 million years, though incredibly old, also isn't that unusual for continents. I mean, right near me in St. Louis, the rocks range generally from about 450 to 500 million years. Not all that different. But there is something very special about this outcrop of rock. It contains one of the most spectacular displays of fossils found anywhere in the world. These fossils have full imprints of all the soft body parts of the creatures that lived at that time. It's almost like a complete snapshot of what life was like there 500 million years ago. And what it shows is really astounding. Nothing like what had lived a relatively short time before. Now, let me show you what typical fossils from just after this time period look like. Let me show you a fossil from right near my home in St. Louis. This is actually a layer of limestone It's about 450 million years old, not quite as old as the Burgess Shale, and it's filled with fossils. I have to say, it's just a remarkable experience to be able to just go out in the area that you live, look at a rock, and find the evidence of living organisms in it. But frankly, there's nothing too unusual about this rock. The fossils here are shells and corals. There are a few trilobites, crinoids. They're hard stuff, shells. None of the soft body parts is preserved here. To preserve everything is actually remarkably difficult and only happens very rarely. It's a particular type of fossil find called a Lagerstätten, which simply means storage place in German, but it means a whole lot more to paleontologists. As a kid, I once had a lesson about how hard it is to preserve something soft like a jellyfish. I remember as a kid going to the shore with my family, and I captured a jellyfish along the Jersey Shore, and I wanted to take it home with me. So I put it in between two paper plates and put it in the trunk of the car. Well, by the time we got home at the end of the day, driving in the hot summer sun, I opened the trunk and it was gone. All that remained was a very faint film with the print of the jellyfish on the paper plate. It was so hot in the trunk that all the water of the jellyfish had just evaporated away. And that's in one day. In a Lagerstätten, you find the fossils of jellyfish 500 million years later. It's really a remarkable thing. Now, the fossil record in general tells us a remarkable story about the life on our planet. Life is really old. Single-celled life existed perhaps as old as 3.5 billion years ago, and it ruled from 3.5 to 2 billion years. A very simple life form called a prokaryote. These took two different forms, archaea and bacteria. Sometime before 2 billion years ago, a more complex form of single-celled life, eukaryotes, formed, and they evolved maybe as early as 2.7 billion years. Somewhere in their multicellular life, and probably evolved independently many times from colonies of single-celled organisms, things like sponges and corals, maybe somewhere around 2 billion years. It's very interesting. By the time you get 1 billion years ago, the eukaryotes had spines on them. So perhaps there was evidence of predation. Something was eating them. And that's very important because when you have a predator-prey relationship, you tend to drive evolution much more quickly. Essentially, the prey evolves not to be eaten, and the predators evolve to eat the prey. Well, 800 million years ago, something really dramatic happened on Earth. It's called the snowball Earth scenario. It seems like there were periods in Earth's history when the whole planet froze over. Even the surfaces of the oceans, or at least most of them. I'm not saying the whole ocean froze, but enough of the surface that life would have been incredibly difficult. And this apparently happened in several brief episodes between 800 and 630 million years ago, sometimes swinging from frozen snowball Earth scenarios to a runaway greenhouse effect with warming and then back again. Okay, this would have been really hard for life to take hold. As soon as it ended, there was a bloom of life. We see evidence for the first time of worms, strange jellyfish-like organisms, frond-like seafloor creatures. This is named Ediacaran life after a fossil find in the Ediacaran Hills in Australia. This was obviously a Lagerstätten. After all, jellyfish were preserved, and I know how hard it is to preserve jellyfish. But there was a mass extinction, it's not clear why, and most of the Ediacaran life forms died out before the start of the Cambrian Period, 540 million years ago. And this sets the stage for our story with the Burgess Shale. Now, before I talk about what was found in the Burgess Shale, let me just talk a little about the remarkable conditions required to preserve a fossil, to preserve a record of it within the rocks. We live on a planet of death. Far more than 99% of all the species of life that have ever lived on Earth are extinct. And in terms of individuals, far more than 99.99999 and whatever of all the organisms that have ever lived are dead. Take some area, your backyard. If you took all the bones and shells from all of the animals that have ever died there, all the rabbits, squirrels, deer, worms, beetles, bugs, mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, dinosaurs, and so on, for hundreds of millions of years, it'd make a pile that would stack high up into the sky. But it doesn't. They're not there. Why? Because the crows and beetles and worms and bacteria break it all down and reuse it for new life. We live on a planet of extreme recycling. You know, you have thousands of atoms in your body that were once in the body of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and every dinosaur that ever lived. You know, atoms once in your bodies are now spread out around the world, a part of every other person alive. And all of your atoms will be recycled throughout the world after you're gone. I mean, there are just that many atoms. However, once in a rare while, an environment gets buried rapidly and gently enough so that the organisms are preserved nearly unchanged. And this is a fossil. Fossils can take many forms. Sometimes they're footprints. They can be casts or molds. Plants are often hard to preserve, but it does happen sometimes. For animals, it's usually just the teeth or bones or shells that are preserved. Many dinosaurs are classified by only their teeth. That's all that remains sometimes. Think of all the ancient animal names that end in don or dont. That means tooth. So Dimetrodon, Iguanodon, Glyptodon, Mastodon. That's because what you usually find left over is just the teeth. Let me give you a couple examples. Take a look at this particular fossil here. It's of a scallop shell. Can you guess how old this fossil is? Okay. This one's not that old. It's only 4.5 million years old. It's actually the state fossil of Virginia. You may not have known this, but every fossil has, every state has its own fossil. This is Chesapecten jeffersonius. Let me show you another fossil. This one is an ammonite. Can you guess how old this is? Okay. This is over 300 million years old. It's been almost entirely replaced by other minerals, so it doesn't look very much like the original shell, unlike the scallop shell I just showed you. But in both cases, there are no soft body parts. There's only the shells left. Very hard to preserve flesh of animals, but under the right conditions, in these Lagerstätten, you can even preserve feathers and fur. What are those conditions? Well, sometimes it's a layer of volcanic ash just above the fossil layer that gives the clue as to why they were preserved. That St. Louis limestone that I showed you, it has a layer of orange on top. That's a layer of ash from a volcano that erupted right nearby 450 million years ago. Yes, there were volcanoes in St. Louis at that time. Sometimes they get buried in an underwater mudslide. Essentially, the sediment along the slope off the shore sort of rushes down the slope, much like an avalanche on land, though it's entirely underwater. And this can bury over all the life forms instantly, preserving them. And that's likely what happened for the Burgess Shale. Now, for ocean-living organisms, you also have to prevent disruption by worms burrowing in the sediments. Frankly, there are very few Lagerstätten finds after 500 million years ago because that's when worms began to proliferate in the ocean seafloor. So anyway, it's really rare, but the animals of the Burgess Shale were buried and locked away 500 million years ago. Now, more burial occurred over the years, slightly metamorphizing the rocks, altering it chemically. The layer of sediment got compressed vertically by a factor of about 8, squeezing it down. It got caught up in the ancient plate collision that made the Canadian Rockies starting 175 million years ago. But then the mountains stopped growing. Erosion took over, began to strip away all the top layers one by one. Rain, ice, gravity, all tearing the mountain down until these spectacular fossils were exposed. By chance, now. Now, in a few thousands or tens of thousands of years, really the blink of an eye geologically, they'll be gone, eroded away. It's interesting to think there may be much better fossil finds right in this area that have since weathered away or that are still underground. But frankly, the ones that we have here are quite amazing. Burgess Shale fossils were discovered in 1909 by Charles Walcott, and he was a remarkable scientist and administrator. At various times in Walcott's career, he was director of the United States Geological Survey, president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. He helped to found the Carnegie Institute of Washington and was advisor to President Teddy Roosevelt. Now, that's a pretty impressive resume for anybody. But Walcott loved more than anything else to just go up into the mountains and collect fossils. And he returned to the Burgess Shale many times up until 1924, sometimes with his wife and 2 sons. And they collected more than 65,000 fossil specimens. I mean, this is a really spectacular outcrop. Even though many of the creatures that Walcott found were bizarre, he tried his best to fit them into existing groups of organisms called phyla. And the find, frankly, was largely ignored. You know, part of it is dinosaur bones have always gotten a lot more attention than the fossils of little bug-like creatures. But the fossils got re-examined later on, in particular by Alberto Simonetta in 1962. And he found that many animals could not fit into modern groups, didn't match any living life forms. And this began to catch people's attention. The quarry was reopened, and more as well, and subsequent work found that the fossils showed many organisms that were not like any modern counterparts. Now, one common creature from this time, we call this the Cambrian period, is a trilobite. And the trilobite began at this period and really dominated ocean seafloors for hundreds of millions of years until 250 million years old. The trilobites were kind of like ocean-going cockroaches. They lived, scurried around on the bottom of the seafloor, though apparently they rolled up into a ball if they were attacked. So maybe a pill bug is a slightly better example. Most of the life forms from that period, however, did not survive, and we don't see them anymore. If you look at the examples from the Burgess Shale, it's a bizarre set of organisms. A very common one, a small little creature, about a centimeter large, called Morella, had 2 pairs of enormous sets of spines that curved around its body. Opabinia was a small, soft-bodied creature that had 5 eyes and a single long proboscis heading out of a strange head that had its mouth tucked far underneath it. There's no species anywhere near related to it that's ever been found. One of the most crazy-looking creatures, Hallucigenia, had no distinguishable head. They're still really not sure which end of the creature was its head. It has a single row of soft tentacles on one side of its body, short, flexible tentacles, but not pairs of them, just a single one. And on the other side of its body, it has a row of pairs of long spikes. And in fact, various paleontologists have sort of drawn it walking on one side or the other. Nobody's really sure how this thing actually moved. Now, if you look at some of these creatures like the Trilobite and Morella, they have shells and spikes, so there must have been things that were eating them. And there were some fearsome predators. Nectocaris was one. It seems to be an early relative to the squid, an early cephalopod. The most fearsome creature was Anomalocaris. It was up to about 1 meter long, and it had 2 long, curved, sort of feeding appendages. Apparently, it could even eat large trilobites. So very soon after the development of multicellular life in terms of having hard shells, you had an incredible diversity of creatures. One of the most important from this time, perhaps, is the small little worm-like creature called Pikaia. It's one of the oldest creatures with a notochord, essentially a primitive spinal cord. It's quite likely that all mammals evolved from a creature just like this one. It's an interesting hypothesis that was advocated by Jay Gould. He said, a famous paleontologist, that early life might have been extremely diverse with very little competition for resources. Essentially, when life suddenly burst upon the scene, there were all of these resources and all sorts of creatures could survive. But as populations increased, so did competition, both in terms of predator-prey relationships and in just out-competing each other for resources. And only the most efficient life forms persisted, with many forms going extinct. You know, the species that evolved later on really seem to be variations of a fairly small number of very successful life forms. So, in a sense, the diversity of life has decreased over time. We see this pattern happening at many levels. Many biologists will often classify life forms according to their genetic differences. For instance, the RNA nucleotide differences. And if you look at a branch, a tree of the different life forms, you can see the three major branches: single-celled bacteria, simple; single-celled archaea, simple prokaryotes; and single-celled eukarya, more complex single-celled organisms. And that's everything. Well, this is all single-celled life forms. So where are we on this? Well, all of animals and plants and fungi are small branches off of one end of this tree of eukarya. In other words, we are all incredibly closely related. We're variations of one particular biochemistry that works really well. You may not realize this, you share half of your genes with a mushroom. I mean, think of that the next time you eat a salad. It's kind of a form of cannibalism. You know, it turns out that the diversity of life has not changed continuously. In fact, for a long time, it generally decreased. From about 450 million years ago to 200 million years ago, there was actually a fairly steady decrease in the number of genera. And genera is the word, it's the plural of genus, and a genus is a group of species. However, history is also punctuated by geologic disasters, things like meteorite impacts or volcanic eruptions that may have driven many species to extinction rapidly. But each one of these opened up many more environments for a new round of increased diversity. An interesting point by Jay Gould is that early on, as the newest multicellular life forms were developing, the slightest chance events, a small change in one environment that might have favored one species over another, could have led to a totally different history of life. And humans might never have evolved. Now, since the discovery of the Burgess Shale, there have been other discoveries around the world of Lagerstätten, sites of fossils of soft-bodied Cambrian organisms. There's the Orsten fossil beds in Sweden. They're 500 million years old. There's the Emu Bay fossils in South Australia, 505 million years, the same time as the Burgess Shale. Sirius Passet in Greenland and the Mioshanshan shale beds of Zhenjiang, China, those are 518 million years, a little bit older. And the conclusion from these new fossil finds is that, first of all, the Burgess Shale wasn't anomalous geographically. This stuff was happening all over the globe. And second, the whole process was a little bit more gradual than previously thought. There was certainly rapid diversification for sure, but not quite the Cambrian explosion, a common term that you will hear that was initially thought. There's also a little bit of a sampling problem. These soft-bodied fossil finds are just ocean floor communities. We call them benthic communities. And that's because they can get buried very quickly by one of these underwater avalanches. So we don't have a good sense of what other communities of organisms looked like at the time. Creatures that lived along shorelines or maybe lived on the surface. There's also another very important story here. There was a wide diversity of more primitive life forms before the Cambrian, but they died off in a mass extinction, and this allowed the Cambrian life to expand. It turns out this is a real pattern throughout our planet's history. Each bloom of life forms has followed a period of mass extinction. The Ediacaran era followed the cruel snowball Earth time. The Cambrian burst of life followed the death of the Ediacaran life. There have been 5 major extinctions since then, at 440, 360 million years ago, 251 million years ago, 205 million years ago, and 65 million years ago. The last one was when the dinosaurs died off. In each case, there was a massive die-off of life that opened up new environments and allowed for a new burst of life to occur. You know, there's a saying, bad things that happen to you are really blessings in disguise. I'm not sure I really believe that. But certainly each calamity creates an opportunity. You know, it's the silver lining of a cloud kind of a thing. For each burst of evolution, other things had to die out. You can't have life without death. In fact, you get life from death. Now, it's not so appealing if you're one of the old folks on the way out, but it's good if you're young and on the way up. Life favors the young. It's not fair, but it's just how it is. Now, there are many places you can go to find fossils, probably many not far from where you live. Every one of them is a geologic wonder. It's really an incredible feeling to pick up a rock and realize that you're holding the remains of an organism that once lived in that very spot millions or even hundreds of millions of years ago. You know, that Trilobite here from the Cambrian period. Who knew? I mean, could this Trilobite ever have imagined that its shell would be carried around, put on display, even filmed 500 million years after it died? You know, to be a part of this big sweep of time, frankly, it really helps to put the small events of our own lives in perspective. It's very hard for me to choose a top 5 for the fossils here. There are really so many remarkable fossil sites, but I'll give you 4 that I think are very influential. First, let me go to Liaoning, China, the GEOL fossil beds. This is a period from 164 to 158 million years ago. This was an area of wetlands, numerous lakes that were interrupted periodically by ash eruptions coming from volcanoes farther to the west. The ash would fall, it would quickly bury organisms, and would create oxygen-free conditions, what we call anoxic conditions. And that's very important because the oxygen allows bacteria to thrive and break down and destroy organisms, this recycling process I talked about. So you want a case where you can't get oxygen in. There are amazing soft-bodied fossils here at the GEOL fossil find. First of all, there's an incredible diversity of both animals and plants, reptiles, birds, even early mammals here. But remarkable is the display of giant dinosaurs, the earliest known examples of many types of dinosaurs. Things you've heard, tyrannosaurs and triceratops and raptors. The first examples are found here. Next, let me take you to the western United States, south of the Burgess Shale, what's called the Morrison Formation, often found in places like Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. This is the period just after the GEOL fossil bed, 156 to 147 million years. These great fossil beds, frankly, stretch all the way from New Mexico to Alberta and Saskatchewan. Incredible fossil finds that reveal a real variety of climates, from swamps to deserts. So you have the whole diversity of different types of life forms living in these different environments. Many species of plants are found here, conifers, ginkgos, and animals, but it's also best known for its dinosaurs. Places like Dinosaur Ridge, Colorado, and Dinosaur Provincial Park in Alberta, allosaurs, stegosaurus, giant sauropods like Diplodocus and Brachiosaurus are preserved here in incredible detail. Next, let me take you to the Mesopit in Germany, just 47 million years ago. This area was a series of lakes at that time, surrounded by lush subtropical forests. And the Meso lake bed was probably a center point for drainage from nearby rivers and creeks. It's thought that a giant carbon dioxide gas release from that lake killed off organisms in mass amounts, much like Lake Nyos in Cameroon that we saw in the lecture on the African Rift Valley. This provided another form of anoxic conditions and a huge diversity of incredibly preserved fossils with feathers and fur and skin is from this time. even some of our very early anthropoid creatures. And last, let me take you to the cradle of humankind in South Africa, just south of the African Rift Valley. 50 kilometers northwest of Johannesburg, South Africa, in the Gauteng province, it was a really dry area with a complex set of limestone caves over the past few million years. And one particular region, the Sterkfontein Caves, is where the first Australopithecus africanus was found in 1947. This is a 2.3 million year old human ancestor. Huge numbers of hominid fossils are here. In fact, a third of all hominid fossils ever found are in this one cave alone. It's also the oldest find of the use of controlled fire from 1 million years ago. This is where our ancestors first learned how to use fire. Well, in the next lecture, we're going to head to the Grand Canyon. We're going to have another chance to look at the effects of time with the Colorado River carving down into the Colorado Plateau. It involves a story that includes the opening of the Gulf of California as well, and even the birth of the San Andreas Fault.